getting short of time, and I'm going to bring in Simon Fell next to ask some questions which might be pertinent to the remarks you've just made.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister, for joining us. So I just want to cover some of the issues we've touched on repeatedly, which is the legislative framework. So almost the first words out of your mouth when you sat down was that the Modern Slavery Act is world leading. Now the Chair has touched on this, but very few people would disagree at the time. It genuinely was a world-leading piece of legislation, but we've heard repeatedly in our evidence sessions that it's showing its age and it could be improved, specifically around sanctions for those involved in the supply chains, and just toughening up the rules as the environment has developed. So there was, in the Queen's Speech 2022, plans to bring forward a new Modern Slavery Act. Could you just give us a bit of an update as to where the Home Office is on this?
I think I answered that quite a lot for Dame Diana's response. What I can say is that we are doing a lot of work, not only in the sex trade, but in other forms of modern slavery, other organised crime involved in things such as nail bars, supply chains abroad where your cotton would come from, whether it's properly sourced or whether it's a victim, whether the slave trade's involved in that. So there is a wide ambit of work that we are doing, and we are considering all the time. We have the excellent assistance of a very proactive international operation, which you'll be hearing from shortly after these witnesses, after we get on to the next part of the session. But I think that we do still punch above our weight internationally in our negotiations, discussions with other countries. We've got our agreement with Albania. My trip to Romania was interesting in that respect. And it's not just sex work, it's down to all other forms of abuse that happen, what's been said as being out of the country, away.
Minister,
upstream.
I appreciate that, but there was a determination made prior to that Queen's Speech that a new piece of legislation was needed. So is it now the Home Office's view that you can operate without a new piece of legislation, or is preparation still being made for that to be brought forward before the next general election?
We're always looking and revising. We have been focused on the crisis that has been in our channel, so that has been the main focus, but we are looking. There's still some very good parts of the Modern Slavery Act 2015, and if I can just say that those international partners that I've met with, some are quite envious of what we have, notwithstanding what is sometimes said in the chamber here. And the Netherlands, for example, I was part of hosting their ministers and law enforcement officers in relation to modern slavery, and they met at the Home Office. They went out on various visits, and they want to emulate what we do with the modern with the referral mechanism. They were quite impressed with it, and they want us to give them some assistance. We can all help each other. So I don't think that just because a piece of legislation is 5-8 years old that you necessarily have to have another one. Some of our finest pieces of legislation, like the Sexual Offences Act, have their history back in the 17th and 18th centuries. So in answer to your question, I think I answered it earlier, but we're not bringing one forward at this stage. We've been focusing on the crisis across the channel.
I look forward to seeing what's in the King's Speech. Moving on to a different piece of legislation then, thank you, Minister. So, online safety bill. One of the concerns that we've repeatedly heard again through evidence sessions in this committee is the actual ability of law enforcement to deal with the volume of information which might come their way as a result of the changes in legislation. What steps are the Home Office putting in place to make sure that law enforcement's actually got the capacity to deal with referrals going through to them?
Capacity is always a major issue when crime evolves and becomes more sophisticated, and the online safety bill is a prime example of that. The National Crime Agency are doing a huge amount of work internationally in relation to getting us ready, and it is going to be a groundbreaking, world-breaking piece of legislation. We are the only country in the world. It's going to be a tough piece of legislation. We've got 20,000 more officers. Are they all going to be have expertise in online safety? Probably not. But what I can say is there is a lot of preparatory work being done, and the National Police Chiefs Council and the College of Policing are very seized of it, and we're working out the way now for the best operationalisation of that. So I'm looking forward to the online safety bill. It will bring challenges. I think AI is going to be a part of that. I think the big platforms such as Meta are looking into that, and it's quite rightly so. And the Prime Minister is putting a lot of effort and funds into making sure that we are one of the best, if not the best country, to get ahead of the AI revolution, which is going to assist us in this field. But there's no substitute for properly educated police officers. And if I could replicate or clone Detective Sergeant Peel, I think we all would.
I think we'd probably agree with you there. But our experience from looking at the United States when they introduced similar measures was that law enforcement was overwhelmed. There was a huge number of referrals put through, and they simply didn't have the capacity to deal with them. And frankly, nor did some of these large social media platforms. So what preparatory work has been going on to get the Home Office ready, to get law enforcement ready, to work with some of these online platforms, especially the large ones like Meta, to make sure that they can deal with the consequences of the online safety bill?
There are very regular meetings with Meta and correspondence with Meta and all the other online providers, as you would think. If I could just step back a few minutes, what happened when we were looking at how the new world of the internet and Google searches and photographs, how that was going to be affected in the child sexual abuse arena. We were all very, very concerned about that. However, we have adapted. We've got the IWF in Cambridge that works, and it was recently on TV I noticed, but I visited some months ago. Fantastic organisation. This government funds that. You can adapt, and that's what we're doing. You have to try and get ahead of the curve. We're putting a lot of money and a lot of planning into it. I've been impressed with what I'm seeing. Obviously, we can always do more. But speaking to the National Police Chief leads in all of these areas, I've met most of them, if not all of them. It's a big task, bear in mind how many they are and how huge a subject this is. But there is no lack of appetite to tackle this. There is focused planning as to how they're going to. But it's got to be hard. It's going to be hard. You're quite right.
Thank you. The online safety bill focuses on large platforms, understandably. But actually, a lot of the most dangerous content, some of the most dangerous platforms are the smaller ones, which fall out of scope of a lot of this bill. So we've talked about Viva Street with you today. But in previous evidence sessions, we've heard that is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of platforms enabling people to access trafficked women and procure them for sex. Now, there are amendments going through the House of Lords presently which would expand the scope of the online safety bill to cover some of these high-harm, smaller platforms. What's the Home Office's view on whether that will be beneficial to helping stop the trafficking of human beings?
The lead minister is obviously DCMS, although we do work closely together as to what we can do. I am personally in favour of pushing to the maximum we can the legislative framework to prevent harms for children, vulnerable people, victims, the population in general. So my ears are open and I'm watching with interest, and there are discussions between DCMS, MOJ and the Home Office. I'm hopeful, but it is a big task. You are right.
Thank you. I've just got a couple more questions, Chair, if that's okay. Thank you. And then just moving on to the illegal migration bill. So we're skipping through legislation at the moment. What's your view on whether the illegal migration bill will make it more difficult for victims of human trafficking to receive support?
That is an accusation that's been levelled quite persistently, but we mustn't forget that the first responders are well trained, well averse in spotting this sort of activity, heinous crimes. We do have a very detailed digital tool which they use, which I've looked at and considered whether, in my layman's view, as I'm not a trained caseworker, whether it's adequate. It seems very detailed. I've got a copy here. I think that there is a lot of expertise in our first responders, and I think it would be unfair to say that victims will not have as much help as possibly can be under the regime. I want them to be supported. We do, of course, have the exception from removal if there is cooperation with prosecutions and investigations in this country. And also we support prosecutions even if it's from abroad. So if there was a situation where someone was removed, perhaps wrongly in some people's views, if they were removed, we can still support prosecutions. I'm mindful of the evidence that was given to previous sessions that prosecutions have been supported from Spain, from France, and I think there was mention of Vietnam also, I think from memory, although I'm not quite sure of that. But they will be supported if we can identify them, and there is much training for first responders to identify them. And we are ahead of the world in this respect. I know that we do like sometimes in the UK to bash ourselves in terms of what we're doing. We are ahead of the world. Countries are coming to us to emulate what we're doing, and even with the assistance of measures such as the IMB to make sure that the systems are not abused.
Thank you. But it's not just organisations who you might expect to say it who are saying this. It's the former Prime Minister, the person who introduced the Modern Slavery Act, who has expressed her concerns, suggesting that the illegal migration bill is going to, and I'm going to quote her words direct, deny support to those who've been exploited and enslaved, and in doing so make it much harder to catch and stop the traffickers and slave drivers. Do you disagree with?
Well, I do personally disagree with the former Prime Minister, Mrs May. I think there is a time and place for everything. Fantastic legislation, but we do have to make sure it works for today. And it cannot be right that our noble intentions are undermined by floods and floods, as many as 45,000 people across the Channel. It cannot be right that we allow that. This is a crisis. We need to be able to deter the organised international criminal organisations and gangs from abusing our system, to enable the resources to go to support just those very victims that the Modern Slavery Act was designed to help. We need to be able to put the money there and not in helping a lot of, I would suggest, abusive and maybe at times fraudulent people who will claim to benefit by a generosity. Legislation evolves in the circumstances, and I have a greater respect for Mrs May, but on this one I'm afraid I totally disagree with her.
Thank you, Minister.
Can I just be clear, Minister, you just